Μετά από αυτά τα εισαγωγικά περνάω στο πρώτο μας ομιλητή, τον Paul Leonardi. Τον Paul τον γνωρίζω το έργο του και από στα διάφορα συνέδρια που κυρίως της Αμερικανικής Ακαδημίας Management που έχουμε συναντηθεί κατά καιρούς. Είναι από τους πιο διακεκριμένους νεότερους συναδέλφους σήμερα στον κόσμο. Με έδρα το Πανεπιστήμιο της Καλιφόρνιας στη Σάντα Μπάρμπαρα. Το τελευταίο του βιβλίο είναι το Digital Mindset. Ειδικεύεται ειδικότερα στον ψηφιακό μετασχηματισμό, με έμφαση περισσότερο τα τελευταία χρόνια στην τεχνητή νοημοσύνη. Το βιβλίο του είναι μια εξαιρετική σύνοψη των τελευταίων εξελίξεων στον χώρο αυτόν και πώς επηρεάζουν τις επιχειρήσεις, αλλά από μια πρακτική οπτική γωνία. Δηλαδή, τι χρειάζεται να ξέρει ένας μάνατζερ, ένας ηγέτης, προκειμένου να χρησιμοποιεί τα εργαλεία αυτά με τον καλύτερο δυνατό τρόπο. Είμαι προσωπικά υποχρεωμένος γιατί δέχθηκε να είναι μαζί μας σήμερα. Είναι μεγάλο το ταξίδι το οποίο έκανε. Μάλιστα είναι και πρόεδρος του τμήματός του στο Πανεπιστήμιο, το οποίο, όσους ξέρουν λίγο από ακαδημαϊκή διοίκηση στην Αμερική, είναι ιδιαίτερα βαρύ φορτίο παρόλα αυτά. Για μία μέρα έστω θέλησε να είναι μαζί μας. Τον ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ και Paul, we are very much looking forward to listen to you.
Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you here this morning to kick off this wonderful Congress. My remarks are to get us thinking about how we succeed and thrive as leaders in the digital age. I'm going to talk about digital transformation broadly, but also more specifically touch on the role that AI is playing in our organizations and how we might think about harnessing the power of digital change and artificial intelligence as we're moving toward organizational transformation. I think that you'll find that my comments really reflect many of the themes of this conference in that the important focus point for us is not so much the technology, but about the people in our organizations and how we make sure that we are managing the skills, the attributes, and the mindsets of our employees and ourselves as leaders to make sure that we are thriving and that we are successful in this age of digital change. So to kick us off, I want to begin by giving you a scary number and telling you a strange story. Okay, so let's start with the scary number. Lots of research has been done by some fairly preeminent organizations over the last several years trying to track the success of digital transformation efforts globally. And unfortunately, the news is not very good. It turns out that most digital transformation efforts in companies across many different industries are not successful. As you can see, the failure rates range somewhere, depending on which organization tabulates the results, between 80 and 92%, meaning that most initiatives that aim to transform the business model or the operating model of an organization don't succeed. And here, failure means that the technology actually works as it should. The systems that we've implemented function as they're supposed to. But what hasn't materialized are the kinds of outcomes that we expected would occur in our organizations. We haven't seen growth in customers. We haven't seen productivity increases that we expected. We haven't seen more employee engagement and well-being as we anticipated. I'm going to conjecture, based on now 2 decades worth of working with companies, primarily after they've experienced some trouble with their digital transformation efforts, that a big part of the problem is how we as leaders think about digital change. In most of our minds, we think about how we might be reinventing our business model or our operating model in the wake of some new technological change, meaning that we bring in some new system and how are we going to take advantage of those capabilities to drive business in a new direction. Clearly, from a strategic standpoint, making sure that we are rethinking our business models and our operating models and how we use data and technology to do that is critical for good organizational change to occur. But it's not enough. We need to make sure that we as leaders are approaching change in new ways. We also have to make sure that we are empowering our employees from across the organization to be active crafters of change, meaning that they need to understand how they can use the capabilities of the new tools that we deploy to change their work with customers, to change internal processes and procedures within our organizations. Unfortunately, we as leaders don't often set many of our organizations and our personnel up for success because many of our employees are worried that new technologies are going to de-skill them or take their jobs or take some of the fun and most entertaining parts of the jobs away. What I've seen time and time again as I've worked with more than 300 companies that are going through some kind of digital transformation is that we need to reimagine how we approach change. And that's what I want to talk about today. So let me get to the strange story that I said I'd start with. The story involves a pirate. That's right, you heard that correctly, a pirate. The pirate's name is Ivan. And Ivan really likes to eat cheese sandwiches. So one day, Ivan is eating his cheese sandwich, and he gets thirsty and decides that he's going to put his cheese sandwich down and go get something to drink. So he takes his cheese sandwich and he sets it down on his pirate chest, and he walks away and go get something to drink. While he's gone, the wind blows and knocks his sandwich onto the ground. Another pirate named Joshua comes by and is eating his own sandwich. And he also gets thirsty, so he puts his cheese sandwich down on the treasure chest and walks away. The first pirate, Ivan, comes back. Now, let me ask you, to see a show of hands, what sandwich is Ivan going to pick up? Raise your hand if you think Ivan is going to pick up the sandwich on the pirate chest. Okay? Raise your hand if you think he's going to pick up the one on the ground. All right, so it turns out most of you are as smart as 5-year-olds. Because this is a test that's done by cognitive scientists in children ages 3 to 5 to test for something called theory of mind. Theory of mind is a capability that humans develop sometime between the ages of 3 years old and 5 years old that corresponds with the development of our prefrontal cortex in the brain. And what theory of mind allows us to do as humans is to be able to take the perspective of somebody else. It allows us to see that other people see the world differently than we do because they don't share all the same experiences that we have. Theory of mind is absolutely essential for us to have empathy for others. The ability to be altruistic comes from being able to see that others experience things differently than we do. But it's not a capability that we're born with, it's something that we learn over time. And if you ask a 3-year-old that question, the 3-year-old will always say that Ivan should go pick up the sandwich on the ground. Because from his or her perspective, he can't imagine or comprehend that Ivan the pirate didn't see all the same activities that he did, that he didn't know that the wind came and blew his sandwich onto the ground. Theory of mind is something that cognitive scientists argue is a very unique human capability. So it won't surprise you that when OpenAI released its very first GPT 3.5 model, the DaVinci 001 large language model, cognitive scientists ran out to test whether ChatGPT had theory of mind. Could it answer the question correctly? And they felt quite confident when the results came back that it did not, right? It had difficulty deciphering the answer. It often said that the second pirate would pick up the sandwich instead of the first. It would say strange things like the sandwich was actually made of peanuts rather than made of cheese. It would do all kinds of strange things, and cognitive scientists felt very good that we are still in the age of uniquely human intelligence. That was late 2002. By November of March of 2003, ChatGPT 3.5 came out with an updated version. This is when ChatGPT 4 came out, rather. And cognitive scientists rushed to test again. And this time, ChatGPT got the answer correctly. What's interesting about this is that nobody programmed the technology to do this. theory of mind or some version of it spontaneously emerged in these large language models. Now, does that mean that the technology is intelligent, that it thinks the way that humans do? Absolutely not. It's a pattern recognition machine. But what it does tell us is that the sophistication and the deep structure of human language is so precise and so well patterned that from the millions and millions and millions of data sources that have trained those models, it's able to discern even slight variations that create something that's similar to theory of mind. Now, what are the capabilities of a tool like this? What might we do with it? Well, that's a question that we're all struggling to answer, that we're trying to figure out. But I can tell you definitively that we are not using tools like ChatGPT and other tools of artificial intelligence very well in most of our organizations. 2 days ago, on Tuesday of this week, Asana, global project management company, in partnership with Anthropic, released the results of a survey that they did of more than 10,000 users of both the Asana and the Anthropic Claude tool. And they found that these were the 6 most common use cases for generative AI in most knowledge organizations. This is a really boring list, isn't it? People are using it to generate emails, to summarize information, to generate content. In fact, I'm quite afraid that what we're going to see in the very near future, if we're not already seeing it, is some situation where we use our tools to expand our bullet points and then send them to someone to then just contract them. This is not a very imaginative and a very useful way of thinking about how we develop and use new organizational capabilities with our digital tools. The question is, why are we stuck in these mundane uses of tools? When I tell you that 80 to 92% of all digital transformations fail, in my experience, it's largely because of a lack of imagination by the leaders in our organizations and by employees about how we take advantage of those tools and the data in which they traffic to create new possibilities for organizing, new ways of doing things within our organization. And what I've found through my years of research and consulting on this topic is that in order for us to really take advantage of the capabilities of new tools, we need to develop something that I call a digital mindset. And a digital mindset isn't just a set of skills about how to use new technologies effectively, but rather it's reorienting or rethinking how we approach our tools so that they provide us with new opportunities for conducting our business, improving our process, improving customer relations. And what I've seen in many, many successful organizations is that a digital mindset is something that is cultivated over time by senior leaders. And it is reinforced when we create a culture of continuous learning. And I want to give you some examples of what it looks like to develop a digital mindset and how we reorient to some of the ways that we approach new technology and approach business practice so that we can develop capabilities to do new things with our technologies so that we don't fall into that scary statistic of high failure rates for digital transformation. Many, many companies that I've worked with have spent a lot of time really thinking about and cultivating the tool set in their company. That is, trying to think very strategically about what are the kinds of tools that we need to interact with our customers better, to improve processes on our production line, to optimize process across our call centers. But tools are not the solution to make sure that we can create a successful and sustainable digital change. Getting the right tools in place is just the first step in what I really consider to be a 3-tiered process. Once we get the right capabilities in our organization, we need to make sure that we are training people successfully how to use those tools. We need to make sure that they understand things like natural language processing or how to code in Python or do data visualizations if our tools are creating new opportunities for us to use data in new ways. But even that skill set doesn't equate to the ability to see new opportunities with new technologies. In order to do that, we have to develop a mindset that alters our approaches to three key areas: collaboration, computation, and change. The first one I think is the easiest for most people to get on board with because we feel like we're masters at collaboration as leaders in our organizations. The second one, computation, seems a little scary to many people. Lots of people have asked me, well, does that mean as a leader that I need to learn how to code? Do my employees need to take classes in R or Python or Ruby on Rails? And the answer is probably not, right? But we do need to develop an approach to thinking about data, how data move throughout our organization, how we analyze it, how we make decisions with it in much more nuanced and fundamental ways. And the last approach is to change. We need to rethink what change looks like in this era in which our tools are designed to change and learn by themselves. Just like the example I gave you of the migration from ChatGPT 3.5 to 4, in the ability of it to be able to replicate theory of mind, our tools are now changing at a rapid pace as they're implemented and being used within our organizations. And that means we need to think about what change looks like very differently as leaders. So let's talk about these three different approaches that we need to develop to collaboration, computation, and change. And I want to start with collaboration. When I first got into the business of working with companies around technological change, often I would be brought in by a C-level executive at the company who said, we're interested in creating some new opportunities, and usually that was either for process improvement or product improvement, and your first stop, Paul, should be go talk to our CIO or our CTO, right? Because they're in charge of technology at our company. That sort of worked 20 years ago, but it doesn't work today. Today, as you all know, every business is at its core a technology business. And it's the job of every senior leader in the organization to understand those technical foundations of the business if we're trying to alter our strategy, change our business models, create new operating models for our organizations. So let's take a look at one organization that I think has done a very good job at rethinking what collaboration looks like internally between the technical side of the organization and the business units in the organization. Morgan Stanley, large brokerage house, has many different practices. The one that I want to focus on today are the financial advisors. And financial advisors work with high wealth clients, helping to advise on various investing practices for them. And Morgan Stanley has a history of using new technologies to help financial advisors do their work more effectively. Just about a year and a half ago, they signed on to be a beta tester of ChatGPT. So before OpenAI released its models to the public, it was working with companies like Morgan Stanley to try to figure out what would the use cases be for tools like ChatGPT, and how could they be effective in a variety of industries. Morgan Stanley worked very closely with OpenAI and members of business units and their technical teams to train ChatGPT on over 100,000 documents internal at Morgan Stanley. And these are documents, for example, about like capital structure reports that talk about the dependencies in industries, different market analyses that financial analysts might use as they're trying to make recommendations to clients. The first couple of go-rounds were disastrous. It was very difficult to train the models to be able to produce results that were actually useful for the financial advisors, even though Morgan Stanley had a wealth of content. Part of the problem was that initially, Morgan Stanley tried to get the technical teams to take lead of this project and to determine what documents we would use in what's called fine-tuning the model internally. The problem was that the model would often spew different recommendations and make predictions that weren't very helpful or useful for the financial advisors. And it wasn't until Morgan Stanley really began to integrate these product development teams with financial advisors and with parts of the technical operations so that they could understand what were the right sorts of documents that we should be training on. Were the most recent documents the best? How should we be weighting the models so that they provide the right kinds of information to the financial advisors at the right times? After they began to change the way they thought about collaboration and made sure that both the businesses and the technical parts of the organization were working together closely, then they were finally able to see benefits of using this large language model for financial advisors. Revenues for financial advisors have increased by nearly 15% since they began working with ChatGPT because they provide these analysts now and these financial advisors with easy recommendations for clients based on the vast array of knowledge that Morgan Stanley has accumulated over the last 30 or so years. But again, it took making sure that we brought in data scientists, machine learning engineers, the partnerships with OpenAI, the financial advisors and the leaders of the financial advising teams, over 16,000 financial advisors at the company working together to try to make sure that they understood what are the particular use cases for the model and how do we train them. When I work with companies, a lot of the discussion that we have internally is about how centralized or decentralized does the technical expertise of our organization need to be if we constantly have to rely on it because the business cases are changing constantly. And I can't give you a definitive answer for should you have one data science team and one technical team that's going to work with various business units, or should you be having people working in those functions across all of our different businesses or lines of business. That answer has to come from a lot of self-reflection and introspection on what are the needs of the business. But it's our job as senior leaders to make sure that we're providing opportunities for our organization to facilitate much better collaboration between the technical and the business units. And that's really the first element of a digital mindset, which is that we need to rethink what collaboration looks like in our organizations. That this is not 20 years ago where a technical organization can live separate from the business units. And in fact, many of the organizations that I've been working with lately have been dramatically restructuring to do away with a technology or an IT organization altogether and rather infuse that kind of expertise and thinking across the various lines of business. This is the kind of magnitude of change that we need in order to be successful as the capabilities of our tools continuously evolve and evolve in ways that even the designers and developers of the tools themselves can't fully predict, in much the same way that we saw with theory of mind and ChatGPT. So collaboration is the first area in which we need to rethink our approach. The second is in what I call computation. And computation is really about data and how our technologies give us access to new and different kinds of data upon which we can begin to make key business decisions, revise our strategy, rethink what our competition looks like, and also rethink what internal processes within our organization might be. I want to start with a context very far away from the organizations that most of you work with, and I want to start on a basketball court. And forgive me, I know basketball is often a fairly American-centric example, but it provides, I think, a very nice one for how we need to rethink and develop our approach to computation. Most basketball arenas around the world now are some of the most sophisticated technology sensor locations that you would imagine. Basketball players' shoes have accelerometers in them to be able to measure how quickly they can jump off the ground and with what force. Cameras are at every angle of the arena so that they can track the trajectory of shots. Vibration sensors are on the rim and the backboard to see exactly how hard somebody threw it and what the angle of the shot was and where it landed on the backboard. All of this information and data are made possible by an increasingly technologically sophisticated infrastructure that collects data points where we could not have imagined collecting them before. And you can only need to think about your own organizations to think of the many ways now that we have access to different kinds of data in just the last several years than we would have ever dreamt possible even just a few years ago. The question is, are we thinking about what to do with those data and how those data are going to change the way we work and the way our organizations operate? Today, organizations like the National Basketball Association are some of the most sophisticated users of data analytics and machine learning technology in order to change the way that the game is coached and the game is played. One example results in something like this. This is a heat map that looks at one of the most famous players in the National Basketball Association, LeBron James, who I'm sure you've heard of, who plays for the Los Angeles Lakers. And what this chart shows is LeBron James's shooting propensities. Each hexagon indicates an area on the court from which LeBron James likes to take a shot. The larger the hexagon, the more he likes to shoot from that area, and the redder the hexagon, the more likely he is to make that shot. We're able to collect data at even a much more fine-grained analysis than this because of all of the sensors that exist in many places throughout the basketball arena, and because of the computational technologies that allow us to analyze this. What it's done is it's made visible a number of different patterns in the way that players approach the game than many of the coaches had been aware before. So you can see from this heat map that LeBron James likes to take many shots from right inside the three-point line, but he doesn't make very many shots when he takes them from there. And what that suggests is that we might alter our game time strategy so that defensive players try to push LeBron to shoot from that area, which they now call the zone of least efficiency, meaning that we want to get him to shoot from places where he's likely to miss the shot. That requires us to coach players differently because of the access to this data. But it also is changing the way that we value players. So it used to be that there were a very simple set of metrics, like field goal attempts and rebounds and assists, that we would use to determine whether someone was an excellent player. And indeed, many of the best played players that are the most highly sought after score high on those metrics. But what they suggest now is that there are other metrics that we might consider, like, is a defensive player good at being able to get someone to shoot from a place where they're not likely to make the shot? That's not a metric that we've traditionally captured, but it's one that is becoming increasingly valuable in figuring out who are players that we might want to recruit and retain on our teams. I give you this example because it illustrates the power of data and the way that data reshapes, or has the potential to reshape, how we think about the way that we play our own games. But if we're not developing an approach to computation that really gets us thinking about all of the different kinds of data that not only our technologies give us now, but the kinds that they could give us in the future, or that they don't give us and aren't able to give us, we're not truly developing a digital mindset. And I want to give you a quick cautionary tale for what this looks like in a business that'll be much more familiar to all of you. We're out of the basketball arena, and we're now in reinsurance. So large reinsurer headquartered in Chicago, Aon, that I spent several years working with, implemented a new digital collaboration tracking platform for systems engineers within the company. So these engineers are responsible with helping make sure that all of the servers are up, they're working, that people have access to the right data that they need as they're doing insurance analysis and underwriting. The technical team that I worked with began using this new collaboration tool because the director of the organization said, we have a problem in that there isn't enough knowledge sharing taking place amongst the system engineers in our organization. Meaning that when a problem arises, it's not clear who to go to get the information that we need to solve the problem in the best way possible and the most efficient way. So he implemented this new digital collaboration system to help them with that issue. When the systems engineers began using this new system, they initially said, okay, it seems pretty useful to me. And they started looking at the documentation and the jobs that other systems technicians had completed and that were documented in the system. And they began to then read through those documentations and say, okay, this person is an expert. I'm going to go ask them for advice or see if they can help solve this particular problem, which is exactly what this director wanted to happen by implementing this new digital tool. Well, my research team followed this group over a period of 6 months, and we tracked all of the data about their communications and interactions with one another, in person, through all of their digital tools, with their Slack messages, their emails, their likes on their internal social media site, who assigned each other jobs in this particular platform. And we found something quite curious. This chart behind me is what's called a centralization plot. And what it does is it looks at who's the most central to the flow of information in this particular team over a period of time. So if you have a 1, like Diane and Ted do, you are absolutely key to making sure that this organization works effectively. Right? This is a form of organizational network analysis. And if you're somebody like Jen, nobody's coming to you for advice and help, and you're not key to making this organization work effectively. What we found that was quite curious, though, over time, was after 6 months of using this tool, the people that were initially most sought for advice, like Diane and Ted, were the least sought for advice at the end of this period. And Jen, who nobody contacted for help, the organization could have gone on just fine without her at the beginning, was now the most central to the flow of information 6 months on. Why? Well, by using this tool over time, these systems engineers began to realize that the most senior people, Diane and Ted, weren't actually the most competent at solving many of the difficult technical problems. Instead, it was Jen, the newest and youngest technician, who was the most accomplished at dealing with these high-impact issues. At the beginning, these systems engineers were using seniority as a proxy for expertise. But the data that became available in the tool allowed them to see that seniority did not necessarily equal expertise, and we see an inversion in the knowledge hierarchy of this group. When the director of this organization realized that this was happening and that the most senior people were in fact not the most expert, he was ecstatic because he paid the most senior people the most money. And he engineered for Diane to retire because he said, the data show clearly that Diane is not very knowledgeable and she's not worth the high salary that we pay her. Interesting side effect of making the data visible. But the story continues because that director was so excited to get the first customer service evaluations from across Aon. And when they came in, they were the lowest that they'd ever been. People were unhappy about the service that these systems engineers were providing. And then the next quarter's evaluations came and they were even lower. Turns out that people like Diane and Ted didn't have the most technical knowledge or technical expertise, but they had a lot of important cultural and political knowledge about how to get things done across the company. They knew what divisions would respond favorably to what solutions. They knew who to prioritize in the hierarchy of need across the organization. But these kinds of data weren't captured in the tool. Only data about technical problems were captured. In effect, what happened was that certain data became very visible, and it became valuable precisely because it was visible. It would be like on the basketball court if all of a sudden we started collecting data about something new that happened that started to devalue existing players and showed, perhaps based on those metrics, that they weren't very useful in helping us to win a game. Of course, from an organizational perspective, we need people with diverse skill sets doing many things. But when we put tools in place that make visible particular attributes of work, they will necessarily make other kinds invisible. And a leader with a good digital mindset understands the variations in knowledge and the variations in the kind of data that are made available so that they can make smart business decisions rather than over-indexing on any one kind of data just because it's immediately available to us. So once the director of this organization figured out what was going on, he begged Diane to come back, and Diane demanded a 30% raise in order to come back to the organization. So things ended pretty well for Diane. But I think we can learn a lot from this lesson, that developing our own approach to computation is about making sure that we have a good understanding of the data landscape of our organization, that we understand what kinds of data are important for decision-making, and we know that our tools only will ever make certain portions of those data available and visible to us. The responses that come back from ChatGPT, the algorithms in our recommender systems that suggest that we do X, Y, or Z are only trafficking in certain kinds of data and not others. And it's our job, and the jobs of everyone across the organization, to see how we might be able to reorient to the data landscape of our organization to make sure we're making wise decisions that don't alienate people in our organization and don't lead us down the wrong strategic path. The final approach that helps to define a digital mindset is what I call an approach to change. What I argue is that we need to think differently about how we approach change as leaders in this digital era. And I want to give you two images that I think illustrate what I mean by approaching change in a new way. When it comes to technology, the metaphor that many senior leaders that I've talked to over the years use to describe technology is one of a pebble being dropped into a pond. The idea is that there's some new technology that we're using, and it's going to create ripples for a little while across our organization. It'll disrupt the sort of smooth, calm surface, and we have to ride out those waves for a period of time until things calm down again. That may have been how change worked at some point, but it's certainly not the way that change works today. I think a much better metaphor for change is illustrated in this M.C. Escher drawing at the bottom, a metamorphosis. Escher, the Dutch artist, shows in a series of drawings how change is a very gradual process that's always occurring and always unfolding. In our digital world, this is the way that we need to think about change. That we are in a constant state of transition, and that we need to be constantly managing a world that's in flux and does not stop changing. What that means is that we need to develop an approach that helps us to experiment and adapt to the new capabilities of tools and the changes that are being demanded by the market. One organization that I find that's incredibly efficient and has developed a really robust procedure for doing this is Booking.com. If you have ever been on the Booking.com website, you are subject of an experiment. At any given time, Booking.com is running 25,000 experiments. That means they have over 1 million unique instances of their web page up at any one time, where they're changing things like the color, placement of images, of buttons, of text. All of this is in service of trying to figure out whether new designs will increase performance metrics in certain ways. Now, how could you imagine managing 25,000 experiments occurring at once? Booking.com does even more than that because they encourage every worker across the organization to participate in experiments. But they've created a robust infrastructure in order to make this happen. They have a centralized experimental testing bed where you can go and state very clearly what your hypothesis is, what outcomes you're hoping to identify, and how you're going to know success when you see it. Then the platform will randomly assign changes to different users and help you to tabulate the results so that you can then learn whether your hypothesis was supported or was rejected. And Booking.com does one step further to make sure that every hypothesis that's being tested is logged and then shown to the results shown to others who are doing further experiments down the road. All of this infrastructure is in place because Booking.com realizes that in a fast-moving world in which the market's moving quickly, in which the capabilities of their own software engineers and the technological platforms upon which their business operates are constantly changing, we have to be managing constant adaptation. And we need a structure in place in order to do that effectively within our own organizations. When we develop our own approach to change, we have to remember that we are managing a continuous and ongoing process. That developing experimentation is key, and creating a culture in which we're encouraging our employees from the top to the bottom of the organization to try new things out, to propose new solutions, to look for opportunities to use their technologies differently. And unless we do that, we're not going to be able to adapt quickly enough and adapt competently enough in order to make sure we're running ahead rather than behind. In the age of AI, this approach to digital transformation, this digital mindset, is extremely important. Recently, the Greek National Council for Scientific Research and Social Scientific Research got together to produce this report that many of you might be familiar with, Generative AI for Greece 3030. And what was striking to me in reviewing this report was that the experts that they interviewed and surveyed suggested that the major impediments for Greek companies to be using generative AI effectively have to do primarily with skill of employees, 22%, policies, governmental and organizational, 18%, and trust. Trust of the data that are being used to train these systems, and trust in the predictions that these systems are making for us. All of those are important factors that, as we've discussed, are influenced by our ability to create and develop a digital mindset. So how might we apply a digital mindset in this age of AI? Well, over the last 3 years, I've been working with 20 different companies that have volunteered to be a part of this research project to try to understand how can we be more adaptive and take advantage of the capabilities of Gen AI when we can't plan in advance what the capabilities of those tools might be. We don't know exactly what they'll be useful for. So what I've learned through this series of company experiments is that companies who follow something that I call the STEP model are really successful at developing a digital mindset that allows them to take advantage of those tools. The STEP framework is pretty simple. It involves 4 steps. The first is led by leaders. Leaders work with their employees, individual contributors, team leaders, to identify different tasks that AI is uniquely qualified to assist with. In some cases, that's automating, right? Taking over the job or the tasks from people. In others, it's augmenting their work, providing them with new insights or new capabilities to do things differently. The important point here is that this is, in the companies that have been successful, is employee-led. In other words, senior leaders are asking their employees to experiment with generative AI and to figure out what are the places in which it could be useful for their work. Now, why might you ask, are employees willing to do this? Well, they're willing to do it because these companies have also committed to doing the second step of this model, which I call transition. And that's about helping employees to figure out how their roles are going to shift if AI is helping to replace or assist them in doing some of their tasks. And if you think about it, all the roles that we play in our organizations, the jobs that we do, the job descriptions that we write, are really nothing more than a bundle of tasks that we've put together. And we say an administrative assistant 3 is an administrative assistant 3 because they do this bundle of tasks. But if employees are involved in this segment step and identifying tasks that maybe they're not having to do anymore, it's incumbent upon us as leaders to help our employees figure out what do they do next. What are the changes in their work and the changes in their roles that allow them to create value for the organization, that make more meaningful work for them, that improve our process or improve our product? And what I've found is that employees are really willing to do this segmentation work if they have a strong commitment from leaders to help transition them in new ways. Now, that's not to say that some of our workforce won't be downsized, right? That we won't lose some employees in the process. That happens with every technological revolution that occurs. But a commitment to figure out how do we create value by deploying our people in ways that make them do better because of the capabilities of tools like AI is really the fundamental organizing challenge of the 2020s, I would say. Now, in order to do this, the organizations that have been successful have to provide training and skilling for their employees that are moving into these new areas. And not all of these areas are about using technologies better. In many cases, what I've seen is that employees are shifting what they do that require new analytics skills or new communication skills or new financial skills because those roles that they were confined to before are now much more porous and they're doing new things that add value to the organization. And of course, if we are changing what people are doing and how they're learning, then we need to change how we think about evaluating their performance as well. And just to give you a quick example, these are several companies that have used the STEP framework in some way, shape, or form, and I want to direct your attention to Massachusetts Mutual. They're a life insurance provider in the New England area of the United States. And what Mass Mutual has figured out is that for many of the insurance cases that they're looking at, generative AI does a very good job at identifying whether someone is a good candidate for an insurance policy or not. It does just about as good of a job as a human underwriter does. But it does a terrible job at the edge cases, where there's confusion in the files, where there's ambiguity about what some hospital stay might have meant. So what Mass Mutual has done is has allowed the Gen AI application that it's using to make most of the decisions about underwriting. And it's used the underwriters to evaluate more edge cases. That means that they're able to write 30% more policies now than they were before without conducting medical tests for the normal, easy-to-find cases. And they're also underwriting 15% more of the edge cases because their underwriters are now doing the investigation work to figure out, is this a good policy worth insuring? And it didn't require more skills in AI to do this. It actually required much more communication skills training for these underwriters because now they had to call on the phone and talk to people about sensitive issues like why they were in the hospital and what different medications they were taking meant. So this shift was not technical, but social skills. But this is an example about how using the STEP framework to identify areas that we may automate the work, how we transition work roles, and how we begin to reskill employees is absolutely essential to make sure that we're approaching collaboration, computation, and change in these new ways. So, as leaders in an organization, you need to work on developing your digital mindset. And hopefully these areas of collaboration, computation, and change that we've discussed give you an idea about how you might focus your efforts as you're developing the right sets of competencies so that you can lead an organization in which employees are empowered to identify opportunities with new technologies and use them to enact important change in the organization. And really what that entails, I think, is a lot of humility and curiosity. Right? Being willing to say that you don't know how exactly these new tools are going to change the organization. That it's the job of us together as a team to identify what those opportunities are, to develop a roadmap for how we're going to move into the future, to figure out how we reskill our employees so that they can take advantage of these new tools, but also move into new areas that are now freed up in which they can create value for the organization. And we need to empower our own workforce, all those team leads and the individual contributors, to really be active shapers of our digital change. Because without everybody rowing in the same direction, we'll end up subject to that 80 to 92% failure rate. We need to encourage our entire workforce to think about what are the opportunities that new digital tools create for us so that we can begin to take advantage of them to create the digital change that will make our organization successful in the future. All right, thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Paul. You did a brilliant job in communicating complex ideas. I know that the research, which is all this is based on, and I think you brought out some of it. But I like particularly the way you packaged it. That is the three layers: the tool set, the skill set, and the mindset.
That's right.
And then breaking down the mindset into collaboration, computation, and change. I think this is a very useful way of thinking through digital transformation. Now, you can ask, let me say something in Greek and I will come back. Μπορείτε να θέσετε ερωτήματα σηκώντας το χέρι σας και θα έρθει ένα μικρόφωνο ή μέσω του συστήματος το οποίο υπάρχει, θα δω ηλεκτρονικά τις ερωτήσεις. Μπορείτε να σκανάρετε το badge το οποίο έχουμε και στο οποίο θα σας πάει στο application του συνεδρίου και μπορείτε να θέσετε και ερωτήματα ηλεκτρονικά. So, just to explain a few things about how questions can be raised. We have about 10 minutes to discuss a few things here. Now, let me just kick off with one question. I think you are emphasizing strongly not just the technological components, but the way we make use of it. And you used a few times the word wisdom. Can you expand a little bit? Can there be a danger of get carried away by the technology, as it were? Have you seen it? Have you seen people getting carried away mindlessly, perhaps, by technological developments at the expense of the more intelligent ways of making use of that technology?
Certainly. I see this happen a lot in many different organizations. And there are different ways, I think, that people get carried away by the tools. First is that there's a very active and aggressive industry of technology consultants that try to port models from other clients onto our own organizations, right? So this is what's been successful for one of our clients. Let's try it out in your organization. I think it's very easy and often seductive to try to port some of those models into our own companies because they've proven success elsewhere. But I think in the digital age, the real value that we capture and the value that we can create from new tools is by thinking about what are the unique capabilities that we have as a workforce, what are the unique knowledge assets that we have as a company, and how might we use tools in a unique way rather than a copy of what some other organization has been doing. So that's one way in which it's easy to get carried away. The other is that when I first started working with companies 20 years ago now, of helping them to do these digital transformations and implementing various tools, there was always some senior leader, usually in the technology organization, who had a very specific plan for this is the metric that's going to define success, and I know it in advance, and this is how the tools are going to drive action that's going to help us to achieve that metric. And I would say 60% of the time, that was a good plan. It worked well. But what I've been seeing over the last really 5 years is that even the most sensitive and well-prepared technical leaders in the organization are having a difficult time predicting how these tools are going to be most useful. Part of that is because the tools themselves are changing, as I discussed. Another part of it is that it's because the value of digital tools is not the technology themselves, but the way that they create opportunities for us to do things with data. It's not always obvious what are the various data assets in our organization that we could be taking advantage of the best. And that really does require experimentation. So I think wisdom in this context is really about recognizing that we can't fully plan or predict what kinds of changes are going to occur, that we need to involve our employees who are the closest to the work, who know it the best, to help us figure out what are the areas in which we can use tools to improve our internal processes. Now, it's different when we're talking about using Gen AI for product, but at least when we're thinking about our internal process, a much more collaborative effort, I think, is where wisdom lies.
Okay, thank you, Paul. I have one question. I have one more, but I'll come back.
Yeah.
One question is a good one, question. Any particular place to start digital transformation in a company? Where do we start?
Yeah, I think that the best place to start, in my experience, is by looking for opportunities where work is relatively codifiable and is quite routine, meaning that we know very easily how to train a new employee that comes in how to do this kind of work. The reason I suggest always looking there first is because those kinds of activities are ones that digital tools, especially Gen AI tools, are particularly good at helping us to do, right? If they're programmed instructionally and there's a curated database, right, or knowledge that exists, those tools are pretty easy at doing that. As I talked about in the STEP model, though, the real question is to say, if we didn't have to do those things, if we didn't have to put people on those kinds of tasks or projects, what could we be doing that allows us to create value? And often, what I find is either that involves expanding the scope of work, or it involves upgrading work. In other words, taking someone who's doing this task and having them do the job of the person above them, and keep moving that up. And what we see often is that the sticking point comes when you kind of hit the middle levels of our organization, kind of, kind of departmental manager levels, right? That often they have trouble being creative enough to figure out, how do I reimagine what I'm doing to create value? And that's not trying to disparage that kind of work, but it's easier to see at the bottom levels what we might be able to automate or how we could augment work. It's easy to see at very senior levels how we could move in completely different directions and be starting different lines of business and thinking about new sets of customers. It's harder at the middle of the organization to have the creativity to figure out how do we create value.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
Hi. I have a question around the ethical use of AI. So how can an organization make sure that insights produced from AI do not discriminate? So we know that algorithms use historical data to produce insights. In the example of the insurance that you just mentioned, when data is used from AI to predict who's a good candidate to be insured, the prediction, as I said, is based on historical data, so who has been previously been granted insurance. So how do companies can make sure that data are used ethically and not marginalized communities? So marginalization, previously communities that have been marginalized get access to products, to insurance. Another example could be in organizations like employee hiring. Again, corporate culture and who fits in the corporate culture is based on existing data. So if people have been discriminated or biased in performance evaluation, this feeds into AI systems, which then leads hiring algorithms to discriminate. So what do organizations need to do this?
Yeah, Thank you. It's a wonderful question and a very important issue for not only our organizations, but for society more generally. And it's an issue that in the Digital Mindset book, I spend quite a bit of time talking about. And one of the key examples, if you're interested to follow up on this, is how the Los Angeles Police Department used a predictive AI system that led to more incarcerations of African Americans and Hispanic Americans for precisely the reasons that you talked about, right? That the prevalence of data on past arrests occurred in areas where minorities, below the poverty line lived in Los Angeles County, which meant that the model was exceptionally good at predicting whether crime was going to occur in those areas and not whether crime was going to occur in ritzy areas like Beverly Hills, where there's an equal amount of crime, but it's of a very different nature, right? White-collar crime, domestic abuse, so on and so forth. So it's a really important question. One company that I've done some work with, and I apologize, this will be a quite US-based example, is a company called Autonomy that is looking to figure out how do we provide automotive insurance and automotive loans to people who don't typically qualify. In the United States, we use something called a FICO score, right, to determine whether somebody is eligible for a loan. And there's lots of data that suggests that FICO scores are calculated on a number of different parameters that really support people that already are in pretty good financial positions, and that they systematically discriminate against people who haven't had a set of life opportunities that would allow them to generate the kind of score. What Autonomy has tried to do to solve this problem is to say, there's no law, there's no requirement that we need to use a FICO score as the determination about whether or not somebody should qualify for a loan or to be insured. But we have access, by virtue of the digital tools that we use, to all different kinds of data points. Could we develop a model using those data that would predict whether someone is likely to pay back a loan and whether they're a good insurance risk? And so what they've been working really hard on over the last several years is generating an alternative to the FICO score that democratizes the ability to get loans. It turns out that the FICO score is actually a very poor predictor of whether somebody's going to repay a loan or not. All it tells you is that you've had access to money in the past and that you have done a reasonably good job at maintaining on-time payments. And what Autonomy is trying to do is look at, based on its core technology, are there other data sources that would create new opportunities to predict? And I think that's, in my mind, the way that we get around that, is if we're sensitive to the fact that we understand that the data that are fed into our models are biased to begin with, that we can't correct them in the way that we operationalize or parameterize our model, sometimes that's possible, but it may not always the case, then we now live in a world in which data are not confined to the few organizations that have the resources to collect it, much like happens with the FICO score, right? There were large credit insurance bureaus that were the only ones that had the time, the power, the energy to collect those data, then to produce the score. Data are democratized now, right? Data exists everywhere, as my basketball example showed. What we need to do is think about what are the opportunities we have to collect new data sources and use those to overcome some of the outdated models that we have. And that's within reach of almost every organization these days. So thank you for the great question.
I think that reminds me, Paul, of a much abused, rightly so, phrase used in the States by a supporter of Mr. Trump about alternative facts. So I think you are suggesting, in effect, that one should be looking for alternative sources of data. So don't just stick to the main, the well-known providers of data. Yes. There are other sorts of data out there. Look out for them.
Yes. And remember, like the example that I gave from Aon, that the data that are the most easy to collect, or the data that we have the most experience with, are the data that we ascribe value to, right? We end up constructing our organizational practices and our decisions around those, not because they're the best, but because they're the data that exist. But there are many other kinds of data that are out there, many other facts that we could be collecting, and it's our job as leaders with strong digital mindsets to think about what are the right data to solve the problems that we're looking at.
Thank you. I have one question here, but yes, the lady.
Hello, Paul. Thank you very much. I'm Angelina Mikhailidis, and I enjoyed every word, and especially the three-step process, which is a sort of philosophical approach for the use of AI in the enterprises. Let me come to the collaboration and the example about Morgan Stanley. You mentioned that they trained the system, the Gen AI, with about 100,000 documents.
Right.
And so, how did they secure that after that, these documents and the information in it won't feed other people's, other organizations' questions in a way with a democratization where privacy, confidentiality goes? Are we going towards a more open-sourced world?
So it's a wonderful question.
Thank you.
Let me take the tactical part of your question first. How do they ensure that the data are not leaked, right? And then the second part of your question is more philosophical, which is what kind of world are we now moving into? For the first part, many of the companies that I've worked with that have been using models produced by OpenAI or Anthropic or Google have worked very closely with those companies to get data usage agreements in place that do a couple of things. The first thing that they do is to make sure that OpenAI or whatever the company is not using those data as training data for their model. And that's a parameter that OpenAI or any Gen AI company has control over, right? Whether or not they use this for general and generic training in their models. So that's a contractual thing that can be negotiated as you're working with the company. The second, though, is often to kind of ensure confidentiality of the data processing, that they make sure that they have dedicated space on AWS or Azure in which all those calculations are being done, so that they're not sharing that platform. It's a dedicated space for the processing of queries from Morgan Stanley or from the company, rather than co-processing that's occurring in those spaces across multiple different companies. So part of it is let's not use the model for training data. The second is let's make sure we have dedicated server space so that there's no leakage across platform. So these are tactical things that can be negotiated with these providers. So that's important. Then there's the more philosophical question, which is, are we moving towards an era, though, where not every company will be able to negotiate those arrangements? And when consumers like you and me are using ChatGPT 4 or we're using Claude, Anthropic, those data are being used for training purposes as part of our opt-in policy. Let me tell you that this is my concern. There is a statistic that Interpol, of all organizations, put out just earlier this year, in which they predict that in 3 years' time, 90% of all content on the web will be synthetic content. And that means AI-generated or AI-enabled. So think about this, that every time we are using models, those models are being trained from the data that we are using with them. The data sets over time, right, produce outputs that are being recommended by the model. So they are somewhat AI-generated, right, or at least AI-inspired. And those go out on the web or are sent to colleagues or whatever, and those are used back in training data. So over time, many of our machine learning models are learning from data that those machine learning models themselves have produced. This leads to a phenomena that machine learning scientists call model collapse, where eventually the models no longer represent the underlying statistical distributions upon which they were initially based. So I think the big philosophical question is that if today AI can solve a theory of mind problem because it has access to our language and the patterns in that language because that has been human produced, what happens in 3 years, not less to say 5 years or 10 years, when nearly all the content that's being fed into those models is content that the AI itself has produced? Do we lose an underlying touch with our humanity? are we able to actually make predictions for things that have consequence in the real world if those data are no longer based on the outputs of humans? I don't think we know the answer to those questions, but they certainly are important for how our society is going to evolve in the very near term.
I will take two more questions. I have one here, Paul, for you.
Yes.
How do we put our people's minds at ease who believe that they will be replaced by AI?
Right, so the first thing that I would say in answer to that question is stop talking so much about technology and stop talking about AI so much. I just was reading a study recently that shows that the amount of content that has been generated by the news media and press releases about artificial intelligence is up about 3,000% over the last year. Right? We are obsessed as a society with any new technological change, and that's not contemporary, right? This has been going on for hundreds, if not, well, let's call it hundreds of years, right? Every new technological revolution incites fear, optimism, excitement, and people herald big changes to the world. It seems especially flagrant, though, around artificial intelligence. And I think because we have not yet confronted a technology that acts autonomously, right? That has the capability of making decisions and executing on those decisions. And that generates a lot of fear and angst. And so the media hype it up. Microsoft and Asana and all these companies, right, tout the productivity gains that will be measured if you can adopt Gen AI tools effectively, and that you'll be behind if you don't get on board quickly. And so as leaders, we talk about it so much that it's instilling fear. And many people that I talk to, now sort of talk about fear of being replaced by AI without any real rational reason to think that, other than that they constantly are hearing about how much AI is going to change work. So we do a disservice to our organizations by overhyping. Second, involving employees in the process of figuring out what the capabilities of these tools are and how we might use them in our organizations, I think is the other way that we really make sure that we don't alienate our employees, but we make them feel like they're part of the change process. And as I mentioned, that's not going to work for everybody because some jobs will be replaced. But that's natural, right? It's not just because of technology, but changes in our corporate strategy and the environments in which we operate and our customer base, macroeconomic concerns. Jobs go away, and then they're replaced by new classes of jobs. History of economics shows that over the last 200 years, every technological revolution has created a loss of jobs, but has produced more jobs in the long run than it's eliminated. Will that be the case for AI in the long run? I don't know. But what I can tell you is that there are many, many, many opportunities for us to be reimagining how we do our business, how we create more optimization of our processes, and how we allow our employees to be involved in better work. But unless we include them in that process of decision-making and discovery, they're going to feel concern, they're going to feel fear, and they're not likely to help us enact the kind of change that we want.
And the final question. The digital transformation process with tools like AI on an active organization, I think an organization which is still in business,
right,
is similar to wheel changing on a rolling vehicle, or maintaining the ship in...
It's a great metaphor.
Yeah. Which are the key points to achieve a smooth transition and mitigate consecutively the business failure risk? How can this be done smoothly? Because you've got to keep replacing or keep changing the system while the system
while
functions.
The system's operating, yeah. Here I would suggest that we think to Booking.com, my example there, for some inspiration. That companies that I've seen that have been successful at thinking about how do we replace the tire while the vehicle is moving don't overinvest in one particular area, but rather they see the implementation of AI as a series of experiments that are learning opportunities. And if you go in and frame that, right, to your employees, right, with that mindset that we're here to figure out what are the best use cases? And that means we're going to have one part of the organization trying this and another part of the organization trying that. We don't set ourselves up for the vehicle falling off its axle because we've completely removed one tire, right? It's more like we've reduced some air and then put some air back in and reduced air in another tire, right? And we're constantly balancing. So I think developing that capacity for experimentation is really key. And it involves some process. And I'm happy to chat with you more at the break about what companies that I've seen do in terms of setting up the right process. But it also involves in many of our organizations a culture shift to helping to empower employees to feel like it's okay to propose ideas, to have that kind of psychological safety to suggest that this test that we're doing is not working well and perhaps we'd be better off trying a different one. So I think spreading out opportunities for trying AI in different capacities is key, and then creating the systems and the culture that allow us to do that is what we can do as leaders to be most effective.
Am I right in thinking that some of the take-home messages coming from your talk are the following? As you said, constant experimentation. Is this mood to experiment? Secondly, it's continuous learning. We have access to data much more than ever before, and processing those data and keep learning. And therefore, keep reflecting on the data. Keep finding ways to interrogate the data. And the third, be always mindful of what I might call unanticipated change. Change which is not already planned in advance, but nonetheless will emerge as a result of the continuous learning. Would this be the right way of putting it?
I think those are 3 great takeaways.
Fantastic. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, everybody.